The forgotten signal, the discovery, the observation deck of the galactic survey station Kepler 9 hummed with its usual quiet efficiency. Dr. Amara Chen sat at her workstation, her eyes fixed on the cascading data streams that represented thousands of radio frequencies from across the sector. She had been monitoring deep space signals for 3 years now, and most days blended together in a rhythm of cosmic background noise and stellar radiation patterns. Tonight was different. At 347 station time, her equipment detected something that made her sit up straight. A signal, weak and distorted but unmistakably artificial. It pulsed with a pattern that spoke of intelligence, of purpose, of desperation. Amara's fingers flew across her console, isolating the frequency and amplifying the signal. The waveform appeared on her screen, complex and layered, unlike anything in the standard Galactic Council database. She called over her colleague, a Xanthari named Quillix, whose species had been exploring the galaxy for over 10,000 years. Quillix's four eyes widened as he examined the data. His translator device chirped softly as he spoke, his natural language too complex for human vocal cords to reproduce. The signal was old, he explained, perhaps centuries old, traveling through space at the speed of light from some distant catastrophe. Amara requested a deep scan, redirecting 3 of the station's most powerful receivers toward the signal's origin point. As the equipment locked onto the source, more data began flowing in. The signal wasn't just a distress call. It was a message repeated endlessly, carrying within it the last words of a dying civilization. The coordinates pointed to a system designated as GC7841, located in an unmapped region beyond the Council's normal patrol routes. Dr. Marcus Webb, the station's chief scientist, arrived within 20 minutes of Amara's emergency notification. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray streaking through his dark hair and the careful demeanor of someone who had spent decades evaluating evidence before drawing conclusions. He stood behind Amara's chair, watching as she played the signal through the station's audio systems. Even without translation, the emotion in the alien voice was clear. Fear, grief, a final plea cast into the void. The station's artificial intelligence, an advanced system called Oracle, began processing the signal for linguistic patterns. The AI had access to over 40,000 known languages and dialects from across the galaxy. For 2 hours, Oracle worked in silence while the team waited. When the results appeared on the main screen, they revealed something remarkable. The language had roots in an ancient dialect spoken by the Vashin, a species that had vanished from galactic records over 800 years ago. Oracle's translation was incomplete, fragmented by signal degradation and the passage of time, but the core message was devastatingly clear. A world called Vashtaral was under siege. An invasion force had arrived from the dark spaces between stars, a species unknown to the galactic community. The attackers showed no interest in negotiation or surrender. They harvested resources and eliminated populations with mechanical efficiency. The last survivors of Vashtaral had sent this message knowing they would not live to see any rescue arrive. Amara felt a chill run down her spine as she read the translated text. The message contained population data. Before the attack, Vashtaral had been home to 4 billion souls. By the time the distress signal was sent, fewer than 200 million remained. The message included coordinates, technical data about the attackers' vessels, and a final request. Remember us. Remember that we existed. Remember that we tried to survive. Marcus immediately opened a priority channel to the Galactic Council headquarters on the planet Meridian Prime. The message would take 6 hours to reach the council chambers, and the response would take another 6 hours to return. In the meantime, the team continued analyzing every fragment of data they could extract from the ancient signal. Quillix worked with Oracle to create a more complete translation. Amara plotted the exact location of the Vashtaral system and calculated travel times from various council fleet positions. What they discovered made the situation even more troubling. The signal was 837 years old. It had been traveling through space since before humanity had even developed radio technology on Earth. The Vashin civilization had been screaming into the darkness for over 8 centuries, and no one had heard them until now. By every logical calculation, Vashtaral should be a dead world, the last embers of its civilization long extinguished. But then Oracle found something else in the data. Hidden within the signal's carrier wave was a secondary message. encoded using a more sophisticated compression technique. This message was different, added to the broadcast at a later time. It spoke of survivors who had gone underground, into vast tunnel systems beneath the planet's surface. They had sealed themselves away, hoping to outlast the invaders. They had food production facilities, water recyclers, and fusion generators that could run for thousands of years. The message ended with a simple statement that would change everything. If anyone finds this message, we may still be here. We are still hoping. We refuse to give up. Amara looked at Marcus, and they both understood the implications. There might still be survivors on Vashtaral, people who had been waiting in darkness for over 800 years, keeping hope alive against impossible odds. The question was whether anyone in the galaxy would care enough to find out. The Council's refusal. The response from the Galactic Council arrived exactly 12 hours after Marcus sent his report. Amara, Marcus, and Quillix gathered in the station's communication center to hear the official decision. The message was delivered by Council Speaker Thalarin, a dignified Valoran whose species had been founding members of the Council over 2 millennia ago. Thalorin's holographic image appeared in the center of the room, his tall frame draped in the ceremonial robes of his office. He acknowledged the significance of the discovery and commended the station team for their thorough analysis. Then he delivered the Council's decision. After careful deliberation, the Council had voted to classify the Vashtaral signal as a historical artifact rather than an active distress call. No rescue mission would be authorized. The reasoning was coldly logical. The signal was over 800 years old. The probability of finding living survivors was calculated at less than 2%. The system was located in uncharted territory, far from established trade routes or colonized space. The resources required for a rescue expedition would be substantial, involving multiple fleet vessels and supply ships. Those resources, the Council argued, should be directed toward current emergencies and living populations with confirmed distress situations. Furthermore, Thalarin explained, the Council had no information about the hostile species that had attacked Vashtaral. Sending ships into unknown territory to face an enemy that had successfully destroyed an advanced civilization was deemed an unacceptable risk. The Council would authorize a research mission at some future date, perhaps in 10 or 15 years. When more resources were available and the region had been properly surveyed, Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. He activated his communication link and asked Thalorin directly about the secondary message, the one that spoke of underground survivors who might still be alive. Thalorin hesitated before responding. The Council was aware of that message, he admitted. However, statistical models suggested that any underground facilities would have failed after a few centuries at most. Life support systems degraded. Populations declined. Hope eventually died. It was tragic, Thalorin said. But the universe was filled with tragedies. The Council had to make difficult choices every day. Amara interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. She pointed out that 2% probability was not the same as 0%. If there was any chance that people were still alive on Vashtaral, didn't they deserve an attempt at rescue? How could the Council simply abandon them without even trying? Thalarin's expression remained composed. The Council had considered all perspectives, he replied. The decision was final. The conversation was over. The hologram disappeared, leaving the 3 researchers standing in silence. Quillix was the first to speak, his translator rendering his words in flat, emotionless tones that didn't match the distress in his 4 eyes. His species had been part of the galactic community for millennia, he said. He had always believed the Council represented the best of civilized society. Today he felt ashamed of that belief. Marcus paced the room, his mind racing through possibilities. There had to be something they could do. They could appeal the decision, gather support from member species, create a public campaign to pressure the Council into action. Amara shook her head. The appeals process would take months, possibly years. Even if they succeeded, any survivors on Vashtaral would be long dead by the time help arrived. For the next 3 days, the team tried everything they could think of. Marcus contacted old colleagues in the Council bureaucracy, calling in favors and making impassioned arguments. Amara reached out to independent exploration companies, hoping someone would fund a private rescue mission. Quillix used his species' extensive information networks to spread word of the Vashtaral situation, hoping to generate public pressure. Nothing worked. The Council wouldn't budge. Private companies weren't interested in expensive missions with no profit potential. The galactic public, faced with countless daily tragedies across thousands of worlds, couldn't sustain outrage over one more disaster. On the fourth day, Amara sat alone in the observation deck staring at the star field beyond the station windows. Somewhere out there, in the direction of the constellation humans called Centaurus, the Vash-Taral system existed. She imagined the survivors, if they were really still there, living in underground chambers, keeping their civilization alive through sheer determination. They had been waiting for over 800 years. They had never stopped hoping that someone would hear their message. And now that someone finally had, the answer was no. Not worth the effort. Not worth the risk. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Marcus approaching. He carried a data pad and wore an expression she had never seen before, part determination and part reckless abandon. He sat down beside her and showed her what was on his screen. It was a communication transcript, coded with high-level military encryption. Marcus had sent the Vash-Taral data to an old friend from his days before becoming a civilian scientist, someone who might actually be willing to do something about it. The message had reached Admiral Catherine Zhang, commander of the Terran Third Fleet, humanity's rapid response force. And 3 hours ago, Zhang had sent a reply. Just 2 words that would change everything. We're coming. The human decision Admiral Catherine Zhang stood in the Strategic Operations Center of the TFS Indomitable, humanity's newest and most advanced carrier. Around her, holographic displays showed fleet positions, supply inventories, and star charts marking the location of the Vash-Taral system. She was 51 years old, with short black hair beginning to show silver at the temples and the kind of presence that made even veteran officers straighten their postures when she entered a room. She had read Marcus Webb's report 4 times, each reading increasing her determination. The Galactic Council's decision didn't surprise her. In the 5 years since humanity had joined the galactic community, she had learned that most council species valued procedure over action, consensus over courage. They had evolved on peaceful worlds where resources were abundant and dangers were rare. They had never learned what it meant to fight for survival against impossible odds. Humans understood that lesson intimately. Earth had been a harsh teacher. Humanity had survived ice ages and plagues, predators and natural disasters, scarcity and conflict. They had learned that when someone called for help, you answered. You didn't calculate probabilities or worry about profit margins. You went because it was the right thing to do, because leaving people to die when you had the power to save them was something humans couldn't live with. Zhang called a meeting of her senior staff. Within 30 minutes, her conference room was filled with the officers who would help execute whatever plan she decided on. Captain David Okonkwo commanded the Indomitable and brought 2 decades of carrier operation experience. Commander Sarah Martinez led the fleet's Marine contingent, 3,000 soldiers trained for hostile environment operations. Lieutenant Commander James Park headed the Engineering Corps, responsible for keeping the fleet running in any conditions. Dr. Lisa Kowalski represented the medical teams, prepared to handle any emergency from combat trauma to unknown alien diseases. Zhang laid out the situation without embellishment. A civilization might be dying in the Vash-Taral system. The Council had abandoned them. She was proposing that humanity mount an unauthorized rescue mission, traveling outside Council space to face unknown threats. If they succeeded, they would probably face censure from the Council. If they failed, they might start an interstellar incident or trigger a war with an unknown hostile species. She looked at each officer and asked for honest assessments. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Captain Okonkwo spoke, his deep voice calm and certain. His family came from Nigeria, he said, from people who had survived colonialism and conflict and never stopped fighting for their freedom. Those ancestors had taught him that some things mattered more than rules or consequences. Saving lives was one of those things. He was in. Commander Martinez nodded in agreement. Her Marines had trained for 2 years to be ready for any mission, any situation. This was exactly the kind of operation they had prepared for. She had volunteers lining up outside her office the moment rumors of a possible mission started circulating. Give her the word, and they would be ready to deploy in 6 hours. Lieutenant Commander Park pulled up technical specifications on his datapad. The journey to Vash-Taral would take 11 days at maximum safe velocity. They would need to push the engines hard, but his teams could handle it. They would pack extra supplies, repair equipment, and spare parts for every critical system. If something broke, they would fix it. That's what engineers did. Dr. Kowalski asked about the survivors' potential medical conditions. 800 years underground would create unique health challenges. Possible genetic problems from a limited population. Nutritional deficiencies from whatever food they had been producing. Psychological trauma from generational isolation. Her medical teams would need to prepare for conditions they had never encountered before. It would be challenging, she admitted, but that had never stopped human doctors before. Zhang felt pride swelling in her chest. This was why she had joined the military, why she had spent 30 years in service. This moment, when people came together to do something dangerous and necessary because it was right. She thanked her officers and began outlining the operational plan. They would take 5 ships, a small enough force to move quickly but large enough to handle most threats. The Indomitable would serve as the flagship and mobile base. 2 destroyers would provide combat capability and point defense. A supply vessel would carry everything they might need for an extended rescue operation. A hospital ship would be equipped to handle thousands of refugees with unknown medical needs. The fleet would depart in 48 hours. Zhang would not order anyone to come. This mission was voluntary. Any crew member who wanted to remain behind could do so without consequence or judgment. She expected there would be some who chose that option, who decided the risk was too great or the mission too uncertain. She was wrong. When the volunteer roster closed 24 hours later, every single crew member had signed up. More than that, personnel from other fleet elements had requested transfers, wanting to be part of this mission. Zhang had to turn people away. She sent one final message to the Galactic Council, informing them of humanity's decision. She kept it brief and professional. The Terran Third Fleet had received information about a potential rescue situation. They were investigating. The Council would be updated as the situation developed. She didn't ask for permission because she knew she wouldn't receive it. She didn't apologize because she wasn't sorry. The response from the Council came quickly, delivered by Speaker Thalloran himself. His message was stern and disapproving. Humanity was acting outside its authority. This mission violated Council protocols and could have serious diplomatic consequences. Zhang was ordered to stand down immediately. She sent a reply consisting of 2 words. Message received. Then she gave the order her fleet had been waiting for. All ships began final preparations. Cargo holds were loaded with medical supplies, food rations, construction equipment, and fuel reserves. Marine units conducted equipment checks and battle drills. Medical teams reviewed trauma procedures and studied what little was known about Vashin biology. Engineering crews performed detailed inspections of every critical system, knowing they would be far from any repair facilities if something went wrong. Zhang stood on the bridge of the Indomitable as the countdown reached its final minutes. Through the forward viewports, she could see the other ships of her fleet, their running lights gleaming against the darkness of space. Somewhere far beyond visual range, Marcus Webb was watching from his research station. The man whose report had started all of this. Somewhere even farther, on a world called Vash Taral, people might be waiting in darkness, still hoping after all these centuries. The navigation officer called out the final countdown. 10 seconds, 9, 8. Zhang gripped the arms of her command chair. 7, 6, 5. This was what humanity did. 4, 3, 2. They went into the darkness to find those who were lost. 1. They never left anyone behind. 0. The Terran fleet vanished in a flash of blue light, racing toward the edge of known space. Behind them, the Galactic Council was preparing sanctions and formal complaints. Ahead of them, an ancient enemy and a dying world waited, and throughout the fleet, thousands of humans prepared themselves for whatever came next, united by a simple truth that their species had learned long ago. When someone needs help, you answer the call. When Deathworlders arrived, system entry. The Terran fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vash Taral system, and immediately every sensor on every ship began screaming warnings. Admiral Catherine Zhang leaned forward in her command chair, her eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed what they had flown into. The system was not empty. The system was not safe. The system was exactly as dangerous as the ancient distress signal had warned. Captain Okonkwo's voice came through the communication system, calm despite the situation. Sensors were detecting 17 large vessels in orbit around the fourth planet, the world identified as Vash-Taral in the original message. The ships were unlike anything in the Galactic Council database. They were massive, blocky constructions that looked more like industrial equipment than military vessels. No elegant curves or artistic flourishes, just brutal efficiency and overwhelming size. Each one was easily 3 times larger than the Indomitable. Commander Martinez appeared on Zhang's secondary screen, her expression grim. The Marine officer had been reviewing the sensor data on the orbital vessels. She pointed out what looked like mining equipment, massive drilling apparatuses extending from several of the ships toward the planet's surface. They were harvesting something, she explained. Resources, minerals, perhaps the planet's core materials. The attackers were still here after 800 years, still stripping the world of everything valuable. Lieutenant Commander Park ran a quick analysis of the enemy ship's power signatures. The readings were strange, showing energy outputs that fluctuated in patterns he had never seen before. The vessels seemed to be running on some kind of exotic matter reactor, technology far beyond what the Council species typically used. If those ships decided to fight, Park admitted, the Terran fleet would be severely outmatched in terms of raw firepower. Zhang made her decision quickly. They hadn't come this far to turn back at the first sign of danger. She ordered the fleet to proceed to the inner system on a cautious approach vector, all weapon systems armed, but not actively targeting the enemy vessels. They would show strength but not aggression. The goal was to reach Vash-Taral and find survivors, not to start a war they couldn't win. The Terran ships moved deeper into the system, and for 3 hours, nothing happened. The massive harvester vessels continued their work, apparently unconcerned with the small human fleet. Zhang found this puzzling until Dr. Kowalski offered a disturbing theory. Perhaps the harvesters didn't consider the Terran fleet a threat. Perhaps they had seen so many species arrive to challenge them over the centuries that a few more ships barely registered as noteworthy. The thought was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. As they approached Vash-Taral, the full scale of the catastrophe became visible. The planet's surface was scarred with enormous excavation sites. Whole mountain ranges had been carved away. Oceans had been drained. The atmosphere was thick with dust and pollutants from centuries of industrial extraction. What had once been a living world now looked like a corpse being slowly consumed by mechanical scavengers. The Indomitable's science officer, Lieutenant Chen, ran detailed scans of the planet's surface. She was looking for any signs of life, any indication that the underground facilities mentioned in the ancient message still existed. For long minutes there was nothing. Then her equipment detected something unusual. Thermal signatures deep beneath the planet's crust, concentrated in 3 locations. Power generation definitely artificial, and where there was power, there might be people. Zhang opened a communication channel and had it broadcast on all frequencies toward the planet's surface. She identified herself as Admiral Catherine Zhang of the Terran Defense Fleet. Humanity had received the Vash-Taral distress signal. They had come to help. If anyone could hear this message, they should respond. She repeated the message in 5 different languages, including the ancient Vashine dialect that Oracle had reconstructed. For 10 minutes there was only static. Then the communication console erupted with an incoming transmission. The signal was weak, distorted by 800 years of equipment degradation and miles of rock. But it was unmistakably a response. A voice speaking in broken fragments of the old language asking a question that made Zhang's breath catch. Is someone really there? After all this time, is someone finally there? First contact with hostiles. The moment the underground survivors confirmed their existence, everything changed. The harvester vessels that had been ignoring the Terran fleet suddenly altered their behavior. Engines that had been dormant flared to life. Weapon systems that had been powered down began charging. 17 massive ships began turning their attention toward the small human fleet that had dared to make contact with their prey. Captain Okonkwo didn't wait for orders. He had been in combat before, and he recognized the signs of an imminent attack. He ordered all Terran ships to defensive formation Delta 4, a pattern designed to maximize point defense coverage while maintaining maneuverability. The 2 destroyers, TFS Relentless and TFS Defiant, moved to the fleet's forward positions. The Indomitable took the center position. The supply vessel and hospital ship fell back to the rear, protected by the combat vessels. The first attack came without warning or communication. The harvester vessels simply opened fire. launching projectiles that moved at relativistic speeds toward the Terran formation. These weren't sophisticated missiles or energy weapons. They were simple kinetic impactors, massive chunks of metal accelerated to incredible velocities. The Harvesters had been mining a planet for centuries. They had unlimited ammunition. The Relentless took the first impact on its forward shields. The barrier flared brilliant white and held, but the ship's entire frame shuddered from the force. Damage reports flooded into the command center. Shields at 40% capacity, hull integrity maintained, weapon system still operational. The Relentless's captain, Commander James Wu, returned fire immediately. Railguns erupted along the destroyer's spine, sending tungsten penetrators screaming toward the nearest Harvester vessel. Zhang watched as human weapons struck the enemy ship. The penetrators punched through the Harvester's hull, creating brilliant flashes where metal vaporized from kinetic energy, but the enemy vessel was so massive that the damage seemed almost insignificant. It was like shooting at a building with a rifle. You could damage it, but destroying it would take sustained fire and precious time they didn't have. Commander Martinez was already preparing her Marines for what she knew would be necessary. The Harvesters were too big to destroy quickly with the fleet's weapons, but the thermal signatures on Vash Taral suggested the underground facilities had entrance points that might still be accessible. If they could get Marines to the surface, they could begin evacuating survivors while the fleet kept the Harvesters occupied. It was risky, perhaps suicidal, but it was the only plan that had any chance of success. Zhang made the call. The Indomitable would launch drop pods toward the largest thermal signature, while the destroyers provided covering fire. The hospital ship would position itself in low orbit, ready to receive refugees. The supply vessel would stand by to provide additional resources as needed. Everyone understood that this operation would be conducted under fire, with hostile vessels that outmassed the entire Terran fleet by a factor of 10. Lieutenant Commander Park appeared on Zhang's screen with urgent information. His engineers had been analyzing the Harvester vessel's energy signatures, and they had found something interesting. The enemy ships were powerful but slow to react. Their targeting systems took several seconds to lock onto fast-moving targets. Their weapons were devastating but had long reload times. The Harvesters had been designed to fight stationary targets or slow-moving threats, not agile military vessels. Humanity's smaller, faster ships had an advantage if they exploited it properly. Zhang immediately adjusted the battle plan. The destroyers would conduct hit-and-run attacks, never staying in one position long enough for the Harvesters to get a solid targeting lock. They would draw enemy fire away from the Indomitable while the carrier launched its Marines. It was a dangerous game, but the Terran fleet had been training for exactly this kind of asymmetric warfare since humanity first reached the stars. The Defiant made the first attack run, accelerating to maximum velocity and unleashing its full weapons payload at point-blank range against a Harvester that had been focusing on the Indomitable. Missiles and railgun rounds tore into the enemy vessel's flank. The Harvester's return fire came too late, striking empty space where the Defiant had been seconds earlier. Commander Sarah Chen, the Defiant's captain, was already repositioning for another strike. Zhang watched the battle unfold with the practiced eye of someone who had studied warfare her entire life. The Harvesters were powerful but predictable. They operated with machine efficiency but without creativity or adaptation. Humanity's advantage had always been the ability to improvise, to change tactics on the fly, to do things that no logical computer would ever calculate. They would use that advantage now. The Indomitable reached its position above the largest thermal signature on Vash Taral's surface. Commander Martinez gave the order, and 50 drop pods launched from the carrier's belly. Each pod contained 6 Marines in powered armor, equipped for hostile environment operations. They fell toward the planet like meteors, their heat shields glowing as they hit the atmosphere at orbital velocities. Marine Sergeant Devin Price was in the first pod to hit the surface. He was 32 years old from a small town in Montana, and he had joined the Marines because his grandfather had told him stories about soldiers who went into danger to help people who couldn't help themselves. Now he was on an alien world, centuries from home, about to attempt a rescue that every tactical computer said was impossible. He felt alive in a way that nothing else had ever made him feel. The pod's doors blew open with explosive charges, and Devin led his squad out into the poisoned air of Vash Taral. His armor's sensors immediately detected the toxic atmosphere, high radiation levels, and surface temperature that would have killed an unprotected human in minutes. But the armor was designed for exactly these conditions. They had trained on Earth's worst environments, from the depths of the ocean to the tops of mountains. This was just one more hostile place. The thermal signature was coming from beneath a collapsed structure that might have been a city once. Twisted metal and crumbled stone covered what the scans suggested was an access shaft leading deep underground. Devon's squad began clearing the rubble, using plasma cutters and explosives to create a path downward. Above them, the sky flashed with the light of space combat as the Terran fleet fought to keep the harvesters distracted. 20 meters down, they found it. A massive door, sealed and scarred but still intact after all these centuries. The metal was unfamiliar, some alloy that human databases didn't recognize. Devon placed a breaching charge on what looked like the door's weakest point and ordered his squad to take cover. The charge detonated and the door cracked but didn't open. Devon placed a second charge, then a third. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the ancient door gave way. Beyond the door was darkness. Devon activated his armor's lights and stepped forward. The corridor beyond was wide enough for 3 Marines to walk abreast. The walls were covered in writing in the old Vashin script, messages and warnings from people who had lived and died before humans even knew other intelligent life existed. The air that escaped from the opening was stale but breathable, kept fresh by systems that had somehow continued functioning for over 800 years. Devon's radio crackled with Commander Martinez's voice. The door was open. The path was clear. Now they needed to find the survivors and bring them home. Devon took a deep breath and led his squad into the darkness, descending into a place where people had been waiting for rescue for longer than most civilizations survived. The impossible rescue, the tunnels beneath Vashtaral's surface were a maze of corridors and chambers that extended for miles in every direction. Sergeant Devon Price and his squad moved carefully through the darkness, their armor lights cutting through shadows that had remained undisturbed for centuries. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits, ancient life support systems that still hummed with power. Whoever had built these facilities had designed them to last, and somehow, impossibly, they had. After descending 300 meters, Devon's squad reached a checkpoint, a sealed chamber with observation ports and defensive positions. Through the ports, Devon could see movement, shapes in the darkness, cautious and afraid. He removed his helmet, wanting them to see his face to understand that he was real and here to help. His universal translator, loaded with the reconstructed Vashin language, activated as he spoke toward the observation port. He told them his name. He told them that humanity had received their message. He knew it had been a long time, but they had come as quickly as they could. The rescue fleet was here. If they would open the door, he could take them to safety. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Devon heard sounds from the other side. Locks disengaging, heavy bolts sliding back. The door opened slowly, and Devon found himself face to face with the survivors of Vashtaral. They were smaller than humans, averaging about 5 feet tall, with slender frames and large eyes adapted to low-light conditions. Their skin had a pale, almost translucent quality from generations without natural sunlight. They wore simple clothing that appeared to be made from recycled materials. There were perhaps 30 of them visible in the chamber, and they stared at Devon and his Marines with expressions of shock, hope, and disbelief. One individual stepped forward, elderly and frail but carrying himself with dignity. Through Devon's translator, the survivor spoke in a voice that cracked with emotion. His name was Keleth. He was a keeper of records, one of many who had maintained the history of Vashtaral through the long darkness.
He had been born in these tunnels, as had his parents and grandparents before him.
None of them had ever seen the sky. They had lived on the faith that someday, someone would hear their ancestors' message, and now, finally, someone had. Devon felt something tighten in his chest. These people had survived 800 years of isolation and fear, keeping their civilization alive against impossible odds, never giving up hope. He told Keleth that they needed to move quickly. The harvesters were still in orbit, and the rescue fleet was fighting to keep them occupied. How many survivors were there? Could they gather everyone at a central location? Keleth explained that there were 3 major underground settlements, connected by tunnel networks. His settlement held approximately 15,000 people. The other 2 were similar in size. In total, about 43,000 Vashin remained. the last survivors of a civilization that had once numbered in the billions. Kelleth could gather his people, but it would take time. Many of the elderly and infirm could not move quickly. There were children who had never walked more than a few hundred meters in their lives. Commander Martinez's voice crackled in Devon's helmet. She had been monitoring the conversation through his armor's communication system. 43,000 refugees. The hospital ship could accommodate perhaps 5,000 safely. The supply vessel could be converted to carry another 8,000 in emergency conditions. The Indomitable could squeeze in maybe 10,000 if they packed people into every available space. That left 20,000 people with nowhere to go. Martinez was already working on solutions, but she needed Devon to buy her time. Devon assigned half his squad to begin leading the first group of refugees to the surface, while he took the others deeper into the facility to locate the other settlements. Kelleth volunteered to guide them despite his age. He knew these tunnels better than anyone. They moved through corridors that showed signs of 8 centuries of habitation. Community spaces where generations had gathered. Workshops where craftspeople had maintained ancient skills. Gardens where hydroponic systems provided food. Every chamber told a story of survival and determination. They reached the second settlement after an hour of walking. This community was larger, more densely populated. When Devon explained the situation, their leaders immediately began organizing the evacuation. They moved with efficiency born of countless emergency drills. Even the children, young and frightened, followed instructions without panic. These were people who had survived by working together, and they understood what needed to be done. Above ground, the situation was deteriorating. The Terran fleet was fighting a battle they couldn't win through conventional means. The harvesters had shifted tactics, moving to surround the human ships. Admiral Zhang was performing a complicated dance, keeping her fleet mobile while the marine operation continued below. But she was running out of space to maneuver, and the harvesters were closing in. Captain Okonkwo suggested a desperate plan. The harvester vessels were mining ships built to extract resources from planets. Their drilling equipment was incredibly powerful, designed to penetrate deep into planetary crusts. But those drilling operations required enormous amounts of power, drawn from the ship's main reactors. If the Terran fleet could target those reactors, they might be able to disable the harvesters without destroying them. It was a difficult shot requiring precision that bordered on impossible, but it was their best option. Zhang authorized the plan. The Relentless and Defiant would coordinate their attack runs, using their combined firepower to punch through harvester armor and strike the reactor cores. It would leave both destroyers vulnerable during their attack runs, but there was no other choice. The destroyers acknowledged their orders and began positioning for the assault. Back underground, Devon had reached the third settlement, the smallest of the 3. This community had suffered more than the others. Their life support systems were failing and many of their people were sick. Dr. Kowalski's medical teams would need to triage them as soon as they reached the surface. Devon began the evacuation immediately, carrying children in his arms when they were too weak to walk. His Marines did the same, using their powered armor to move the most vulnerable refugees quickly. The first refugees began arriving at the surface extraction point, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The sky above Vashterel was alive with light from the space battle. Explosions and weapon fire created a deadly light show across the darkness. For people who had lived underground for generations, the sight was overwhelming. Some began to cry. Others simply stared in awe at the open sky they had never seen. Marine Lieutenant Maya Santos was coordinating the surface evacuation. She directed refugees into transport shuttles that would carry them up to the waiting hospital ship. Each shuttle could hold 300 people, and they needed to make dozens of trips. Maya pushed her people hard, knowing that every second mattered. The shuttles launched continuously, creating a steady stream of traffic between the surface and orbit. Commander Martinez was managing the entire operation from her command center on the Indomitable. She watched refugee counts climb while simultaneously tracking the space battle. The numbers were impossible. They had evacuated 17,000 refugees so far. They needed to extract 26,000 more. The ships were already overcrowded. People were being packed into cargo bays and engineering spaces. And still, they needed more room. Lieutenant Commander Park appeared on Martinez's screen with a solution born of desperation. The supply vessel was carrying fuel, food, and equipment that could be jettisoned. If they dumped cargo into stable orbit, they could use the entire vessel as a refugee transport. They would lose valuable supplies, but they would gain space for another 15,000 people. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Zhang authorized the plan immediately. The supply vessel began ejecting cargo pods, creating a trail of supplies that would orbit Vashtaral until they could be recovered. Each pod that left the ship created room for more refugees. The crew worked with frantic energy, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on their speed. The Relentless made its attack run first. Commander Wu guided his ship through a gauntlet of harvester fire, his shields flaring with impacts. At the last possible moment, he fired everything his destroyer had at a single harvester's reactor core. The weapon struck perfectly, and the harvester's power systems failed in a cascading shutdown. The massive vessel went dark, drifting in orbit without power or control. The Defiant repeated the maneuver on a second harvester, with Commander Chen demonstrating the kind of flying the pilots would study in training simulations for years. The second harvester fell silent. 2 down, 15 still active. But the remaining harvesters had learned. They began repositioning, protecting their reactor cores, making the same tactic impossible to repeat. Devon emerged from the tunnels with the last group of refugees from the third settlement. He was exhausted, his powered armor running on reserve power. Behind him came hundreds of Vashin supporting each other, carrying their sick and elderly. They moved toward the shuttles with the determination of people who knew this was their only chance. Maya Santos directed them aboard, packing the shuttles beyond their safety ratings, knowing that safety margins meant nothing if they left people behind. The refugee count reached 35,000, then 38,000, then 40,000. The Terran ships were filled beyond capacity. People stood in corridors because there was no more room to sit. The life support system strained under the load. And still, 3,000 refugees remained on the surface, the last evacuees making their way from the deepest tunnels. Admiral Zhang watched her tactical display with growing dread. The harvesters were forming an attack pattern that would cut off the shuttle's escape route. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, they would begin a bombardment that would destroy the surface extraction point and everyone still on it. She needed a miracle, or she needed to make a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Leave 3,000 people behind or risk her entire fleet trying to save them. Captain Okonkwo provided the miracle. He had been studying the harvester movements and had noticed something crucial. The enemy vessels were coordinating their attacks, moving in synchronized patterns. That meant they were communicating, likely using a command ship that directed the others. If the Terran fleet could identify and disable that command vessel, the others might lose coordination. Okonkwo's sensors had identified the most likely candidate, a harvester that remained in the center of the formation, protected by the others. Zhang understood immediately. Destroy the command ship, create chaos among the harvesters, and buy time for the final evacuation. It would require the Indomitable to make a direct assault run through the entire enemy formation. The carrier wasn't designed for that kind of combat. But Zhang had never let ship design limitations stop her before. She gave the order. The Indomitable would make the run. All other ships would provide maximum covering fire. The carrier accelerated toward the harvester formation, every weapon firing. Missiles streaked ahead, detonating against harvester shields and armor. Rail guns pounded enemy vessels with continuous fire. The Indomitable shook from return fire, her shields collapsing under the assault. Armor plates melted and vaporized. Damage reports cascaded through the command center. But Zhang kept the ship on course, driving toward the command vessel at the formation's heart. When they reached optimal firing range, Zhang ordered a full spread of nuclear-tipped missiles. Humanity had brought weapons from Earth, devices that the peaceful council species considered barbaric. But those weapons had one advantage: they delivered overwhelming destructive force. The missiles struck the command harvester's reactor core, and the resulting explosion was visible from the planet's surface. The command harvester disintegrated in a flash of white light. The remaining harvester vessels immediately lost coordination. Some continued their previous orders. Others stopped moving entirely. A few began attacking each other, their targeting systems confused by the loss of command input. The Terran fleet had created exactly the chaos they needed. Maya Santos screamed orders at her surface teams. Final shuttle, load everyone aboard. The last 3,000 refugees ran for the waiting transport, Devon and his Marines providing rear guard. The shuttle lifted off with people still climbing aboard, its cargo bay doors closing as the craft achieved altitude. Below, the extraction point was bombarded by harvester fire. Seconds mattered. They had escaped with seconds to spare. The Terran fleet turned away from Vashterol, their ships loaded beyond capacity, damage reports filling every command screen. Behind them, the harvester vessels continued their confusion, some firing randomly while others drifted without purpose. Admiral Zhang didn't know how long the chaos would last, but she didn't need long. Just enough time to get her fleet and its precious cargo out of the system. The aftermath. The journey back to Council space took 12 days instead of 11. The Terran fleet had to move slowly with their damaged ships and overloaded refugee capacity. Every habitable space on every vessel was filled with Vashin survivors. They sat in corridors, cargo bays, engineering spaces, anywhere there was room. The ship's life support systems ran at maximum capacity, recycling air and water for a population they were never designed to support. Dr. Kowalski and her medical teams worked around the clock treating the refugees. Centuries underground had created unique health challenges, vitamin deficiencies, genetic complications from limited population diversity, psychological trauma from generational imprisonment. The medical staff dealt with conditions they had never encountered before, improvising treatments and protocols as they went. It was exhausting, overwhelming work. They saved thousands of lives during that journey. The Vashin themselves adapted to their rescue with remarkable resilience. They had survived 800 years in darkness by being flexible and determined. Now they applied those same qualities to their new situation. They helped manage their own communities aboard the ships, organizing food distribution and medical care. They assisted with minor repairs, learning quickly how human technology worked. They sang songs that had been passed down through generations, filling the ship's corridors with melodies from a vanished age. Keleth, the record keeper, spent hours with Admiral Zhang, sharing the history of his people. He told her about the Vashin civilization before the harvesters came. They had been artists and philosophers, scholars and dreamers. Their cities had been filled with beauty and learning. When the harvesters arrived, the Vashin had no military, no weapons, no concept of war. They had tried diplomacy and negotiation. The harvesters had responded with extermination. The survivors had fled underground, determined to preserve what they could of their culture and people. For 800 years they had maintained their identity, teaching each generation about the surface world they had never seen, keeping hope alive that someday they would reclaim it. Zhang asked if the Vashin would want to return to their world once the harvesters were gone. Keleth shook his head slowly. Vashtaral was a corpse now, stripped of resources and beauty. Perhaps future generations might terraform and restore it, but that would take centuries more. For now, the survivors needed a new home. They needed a place to rebuild and remember. Zhang made a decision that she knew would complicate Earth's relationship with the Council even further. She offered the Vashin sanctuary on human worlds. Earth had colonies throughout its local sector, young settlements that could use the kind of determination and knowledge the Vashin possessed. The refugees would be welcomed, not as refugees but as partners in building something new. Keleth wept when she made the offer. After 800 years of darkness, his people would finally see the sky again. The fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Council space to find a reception committee waiting. 36 Council vessels surrounded the Terran fleet, led by a Valoran dreadnought that dwarfed even the largest human ships. Admiral Zhang received a priority communication from Council Speaker Thaloran. His message was formal and cold. Humanity had violated Council protocols, conducted unauthorized military operations, and created a potential diplomatic incident. The Terran fleet was ordered to submit to Council authority for immediate investigation and possible sanctions. Zhang looked at the Council fleet surrounding her damaged ships. She looked at the 43,000 refugees packed into spaces, meant for less than half that number. She thought about Sergeant Devon Price carrying sick children through underground tunnels. She remembered Commander Wu making an attack run that should have been suicide. She considered Dr. Kowalski treating patients with conditions no human doctor had ever seen before. Then she opened a communication channel to the entire Council fleet, broadcasting on every frequency so that everyone would hear. She told them exactly what humanity had done. They had traveled to a dying world that the Council had abandoned. They had fought an enemy that no Council species wanted to face. They had rescued 43,000 people who had been waiting for help for over 800 years. They had done it without council permission because the council had proven unwilling to act. And if following council protocols meant leaving people to die, then humanity would violate those protocols every single time. The communication channel went silent. Zhang waited, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended in diplomacy or disaster. Then a new voice came through, one that Zhang didn't recognize. It belonged to a Lyrian, one of the peaceful, artistic species that made up a significant portion of the council. The Lyrian spoke softly but clearly. His people remembered. 3 years ago, the Krath Dominion had attacked a Lyrian colony. The council had deliberated and delayed. But humanity had come. Humans had fought. Humans had saved 30,000 Lyrian civilians when no one else would help. The Lyrian people had not forgotten that debt. They would not stand with the council against humanity today. Another voice joined the conversation. A Zenthari this time, followed by a representative from the Meridian Collective. Species after species began speaking up, sharing stories of times when humanity had helped them, small incidents that the council had barely noticed, but which had meant everything to the people involved. Humans sharing medical technology, humans providing disaster relief, humans responding to distress calls that other species ignored. The pattern was clear. Humanity might be new to the galactic community, but they had already proven what kind of neighbors they would be. Speaker Thalarin's voice returned to the channel, but his tone had changed. The council recognized the unusual circumstances of the Vashtaral situation. While humanity's actions had been technically inappropriate, the results were difficult to criticize. The council would conduct a formal review, but no immediate sanctions would be imposed. The Vashin refugees would be granted provisional protection status, while permanent settlement arrangements were made. The conversation was over. The council fleet withdrew, leaving the Terran vessels free to continue to their destination. Zhang felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying finally released from her shoulders. They had done it. Against all odds and all expectations, they had brought the survivors home. The fleet proceeded to the nearest human colony, a world called New Perth, that had volunteered to accept the Vashin refugees. As the ships entered orbit, the Vashin crowded every viewport, pressing close to see their first new world in 800 years. New Perth was beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents, forests and plains and mountains that touched the sky. It was alive in ways Vashtaral would never be again. Keleth stood beside Admiral Zhang as the first transport shuttles prepared to launch toward the surface. He asked her why humans had come for them. They were strangers from a dead civilization. Humanity had gained nothing from this rescue except council disapproval and damaged ships. Why risk so much for people they had never met? Zhang thought about how to answer. She could talk about human values or moral obligations. She could explain humanity's history of helping others. But instead, she told him a simpler truth. When someone calls for help, you answer. That's what it means to be human. You go into the darkness to find those who are lost. You don't calculate the costs or worry about the consequences. You do what's right because anything else is unacceptable. Keleth nodded slowly, understanding. His people had survived for 800 years on hope. Humanity had fulfilled that hope, not because it was easy or profitable or approved by the council, but simply because someone needed help. The Vashin would remember. Their children and grandchildren would remember. Someday, when humanity needed help, the Vashin would answer that call. That was the debt they owed and the promise they made. The transport shuttles began their descent toward New Perth, carrying refugees who were refugees no longer. They were survivors. They were the last living representatives of a civilization that had refused to die. And they were proof that in a galaxy of peaceful species who calculated risks and waited for approval, humanity had offered something different. They had offered hope backed by action, compassion reinforced with courage. Admiral Zhang watched the shuttles descend and thought about the report she would need to file with Earth Command. The mission had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. They had rescued every survivor. They had lost no ships and remarkably few crew members given the circumstances. They had even managed to avoid starting a war with the Council, though that had been closer than she would prefer. But more than the tactical success, something else had been accomplished. The galaxy had learned what humanity would do when someone called for help. They had seen Deathworlders risk everything to save strangers. They had witnessed human determination, human courage, and human compassion in action. The Galactic Council might officially disapprove, but the people of the galaxy would remember. And somewhere in the Vash-Taral system, 17 harvester vessels drifted in confused silence. Their command structure destroyed, their purpose interrupted for the first time in centuries. They would eventually recover and reorganize, but they had learned something too. They had learned that the galaxy had changed. A new species had arrived, one that didn't calculate probabilities or wait for permission. One that came when called and fought when necessary. The Deathworlders had announced their presence. The galaxy would never be the same.